What is up, guys? This is QM from the Trinity of Lift, and today I'm going to bring all of you guys my Yosenju deck profile for the September 2016 format. Now, before I even say anything about the deck, please excuse that the entire main deck is colored in like 3 different colors. The reason why the main deck isn't sleeved in all the same color sleeves is because a lot of the cards that I'm going to be showcasing for you guys today in the deck profile is actually not mine. A good amount of this deck is actually from a friend actually who let me borrow the cards. So again, just keep that in mind, and that is why I haven't sleeved the whole deck in white sleeves. But moving on, yes, I am profiling a Yosenju deck today, and to be honest, I don't think I've profiled this deck on the channel in maybe like a year and a half. Like, I know I did a profile of this deck like a couple of weeks after the Secret Forces launch last year, but ever since then, I don't think I've ever done a deck profile of this deck. I don't quite remember. But still, though, I thought I'd revisit the deck today because I do have a lot of the cards that can try and bring Yosenjus into the current metagame. So without further ado, we're just going to jump right into it, starting off with the main deck as per usual. Alrighty, so we're going to start off with all of the Bro Senjus first. We're, of course, going to have 3 copies of Kama 1. Now, Kama 1 is by far the best one because it's your only removal in the form of a Yosenju in this deck. So, because even if its removal isn't the greatest, because, again, it is just a walking compulse, basically, still, though, it is really good at removing some extra deck monsters. And, again, because it is the only Yosenju removal we have in the main deck, it's pretty important to have it 3. So, of course, we have 3 copies of Kama 1. Then we have only 2 copies of Kama 2, and I think it's kind of funny that we're running 2 copies of Kama 2. But the point of it is that you don't need 3 copies of this card. Like, it just doesn't do anything. You're essentially only using Kama 2 as a name that you can search off of Kama 3. Outside of that, you really don't have like a real use for this guy, which is why you only do have 2 copies of it. Again, though, you still do need the 2 copies just because you need to have those names in the deck so you can do your big Yosenju summoning chains. So that is why we have 2 copies of Kama 2. Moving on, we of course have 3 copies of Kama 3. Of course, we have to have 3 of this card because it is the searcher of the deck. You need this card to help constantly build your boards up bigger and bigger. So basically, without this card in the deck, you're kind of running a really bad deck anyway. So you, of course, need 3 copies of Kama 3 because he just gets you into those really big Yosenju pushes. So again, we have 3 of that guy. Then, finally, for the last Yosenju, we only have 2 copies of Sujik. Now, I don't like 3 copies of Sujik. I was originally testing 3 copies of Sujik because I thought this card was really good. And in all honesty, its effect is really good in the scope of the Yosenju deck. But the thing is, because we are actually running Cards of Demise in this deck, you don't really ever want to draw Sujik because even if it does have that honest-ish kind of effect, it's kind of in the sense where it's similar to Kama 2, where it doesn't do a lot by itself, like in terms of effect wise, because sure, pumping up a Yosenju monster by 1000 seems like it's pretty good in this deck, but comparatively to Kama 1 and Kama 3, his effect is just not as good. So because of that, you have to cut 1 probably just to try and minimize as much monsters as you have in this deck. So yeah, that'll be it for the entire 10 monster lineup in this deck. Moving on to the spells, we of course have 3 copies of Card of Demise. This card is dumb. This card is dumb. This card is dumb. Yeah. This card is dumb. So yeah, we have 3 copies of that card. Then for the rest of the spells, we either have just consistency cards or we have degenerate spells, I guess you could say. We of course have 3 copies of Tenki to search out all of our Yosenjus. Then we have 3 copies of Duality because lol, we don't special summon unless we're going into the extra deck for a very specific threat. And because of that, Duality is of course a staple at 3. Then of course we also have the 1 copy of Upstart Goblin because Upstart Goblin. Then, moving on to the actual degenerate spell cards, we also have every single board nuke that we can run. We have 2 copies of Dark Hole and a Raigeki. Now, in this deck, it's actually really good to run Dark Hole, of course, because since you will never basically have a field most of the time, Dark Hole essentially turns into a Raigeki, so you kind of have 3 Raigekis in the deck, which is pretty stupid by itself. And again, the Kamas have an issue just trying to deal with really big threats that have some kind of immunity, namely Dark Destroyer. And because of that, having just board nukes in the deck really can try and help kill the deck and bring them to your size. So yeah, we have these cards to round off the big board nukes. And then of course for the final spell we have D-Fisher because this card is freaking degenerate. So I mean, you're trying to play as degenerately as possible with this deck, so you have to have the degenerate cards, which is of course D-Fisher as one of them. So yeah. That'll be it for the spell lineup. Moving on to the traps, which is actually quite a few of them. We of course start off with 3 copies of Drowning Mirror Force. Like, I don't know why they didn't just call this Mirror Force Yosenju Mirror Force, because this card was basically made for this deck. Because you will never have a board basically unless you go into your extra deck. Drowning Mirror Force is always going to be live, and yeah, Drowning Mirror Force is a pretty freaking broken Mirror Force for that matter. So having this card live all the time and you're able to just throw it out whenever you have it is pretty freaking good. Like, yeah, it's just broken in this deck. So of course we have 3 copies of Drowning Mirror Force because it's just so darn good. Moving on, I have 3 copies of the Blazing Mirror Force. Now, this card is in here because you want to try and beat your opponent as fast as you can, but it's kind of weird for me to say that in a Yosenju deck, because if you guys have played this deck before, you guys will know that the Yosenjus aren't really a deck that tries to push for OTKs as quickly as possible. But the thing is, in this metagame, you still don't want to try and get into the grind game, because in my opinion, I feel like a lot of the decks nowadays really actually can grind you out of resources pretty quick if you're not careful. So because of that, I have 3 copies of Blazing in here to kind of act as just another way to deal damage to your opponent, to again just try and put them on a faster clock. So okay, so again, we have 3 copies of Blazing Mirror Force just for that. Then for the final Mirror Forces in the deck, I have 2 copies of Storming. Now, I feel Storming is probably the worst Mirror Force right now. It's not because it's a bad trap card per se, but it's because in this deck, Drowning Mirror Force and Blazing Mirror Force do serve a lot more of a better purpose than Storming. As sure, Storming does buy you a turn, but all the other Mirror Forces in the deck also buy you a turn, and their removal or their extra effects are usually going to outweigh what Storming Mirror Force brings to the table. So because of that, I only do have 2 copies of this Mirror Force because I just really feel like it's not the greatest, but you still got to run it because it's still a really good battle trap. So yeah, we have 2 copies of Storming. Moving on to the other traps, we have 3 copies of Strike, of course, because this card is good. We also have 1 copy of Warning because this card is good. And then we also have 1 copy of Bottomless because this card is good. So yeah, that'll be it for pretty much all the the not floodgatey traps. Moving on to the actual floodgates, we have 1 copy of Emptiness, 1 copy of Macro, and 1 copy of Lose a Turn. Now, I know you can run multiple copies of Lose a Turn, but the reason why I didn't want to run like 2 or 3 of this card is because you never want to draw multiples of any given floodgate, because then you don't stack the floodgate effects, of course. And because of that, I felt like 1 copy of each of the floodgates is just fine, because of course you can only run 1 copy of Macro and Emptiness. But the thing is, again, going back to the Lose a Turn, you really don't need more than 1, because if you draw multiple Lose a Turn, you're essentially breaking your hand really bad. So I only really feel like 1 Lose a Turn is necessary, because again, you already have so much degenerate cards in this deck that you don't need to try and add more to this deck when you already can be degenerate and floodgate your opponent, kill your opponent, yada yada yada. You don't really need multiple Lose a Turns. So yeah, that'll be it for the entire 40 card main deck. Moving on to the extra. Now, I'll be straight up when I say that the extra is pretty bad. Like, there's a lot of multiples in here because the extra deck for your Yosenjus is so lenient in the sense where you can basically throw whatever the heck you want into this extra deck, that I kind of just followed that idea where I just threw whatever the heck I wanted into this extra deck. So please keep that in mind. First of all, we have 2 copies of Gaga Cowboy. Now, this card actually is not irrelevant in this deck. You need 2 copies of this card in the extra because there is an OTK in this deck that actually does happen sometimes, where if you attack your opponent directly with comma 1, 2, 3, and then Sujik, you're gonna deal 6,900 damage. And because again, you should, like, in that play, you'll have 4 Yosenjus on board, and because your opponent is only gonna be at 1,100 life points, you can just make 2 copies of Cowboy for game. And again, because of that, double Cowboy does come up into this deck, and this is actually one of the few mandatory 2-ofs in the extra deck. Moving on, we also have 2 copies of Castel. Now, this is where it's going to get into the kind of unnecessary multiples, but again, it's just because this deck is so lenient in space and I don't have all the rank 4s that, again, you can kind of just throw in whatever the heck you have in your binders. So that is why I have 2 copies of Castel in here. I also have 2 copies of Diamond Dire because, again, following the same suit, I don't have much else. So 2 copies of Diamond Dire because it might come up and stuff. Moving on, we also have 1 copy of Lightning Chidori because this card can be made in this deck, so that's pretty cool. I have Utopia the Lightning and Utopia. Now, these cards are pretty mandatory because you do need a way to punch over really big threats like Cosmo Dark Planet, if that's a thing, and Blue Eye Spirit Dragon as well. Like, again, just these things that you need to, like, punch over as quickly as you can. Utopia the Lightning is just, again, a very good utility card in this deck because it gets over a lot of those big threats. Then we also have 1 copy of Tiger King because you can make it in this deck. We have 1 copy of Honor Arc to be as a sort of defensive rank 4. We have one copy of Rafflesia because we have Bottomless in this deck, so why not? We have one copy of Dark Rebellion, again, to follow the suit of trying to get over big things. We have one copy of Dweller because we don't like BA. And then finally we have the one copy of number 80 because I didn't know what else to freaking throw into this deck. So if you guys can kind of follow the trend. So yeah, guys, that'll be it for my Yosenju deck profile for the September 2016 format. Again, like, I'm sorry for the quality of the sleeves in the main deck and how the extra deck was kind of made kind of shoddily, but I mean, this is Yosenju's. Like, I kind of don't want to bank off this fact, but it's Yosenju's. There's not a lot of thought process to go into this deck. This deck is a pretty straightforward, easy to pick up deck that, well, if you have the trap cards to throw into it, you can make this deck pretty good. So that is why I built the deck the way I built it today. And I hope you all very much did enjoy this video as usual. And as always, this is QRM from the Trinity of Lift. And I'll see all of you guys later. Peace out.